The brakeman's fist closed on the back of her collar, and then there was nothing under Della but cold air and the grinding shriek of iron. She struck the embankment shoulder first, rolled through frozen cinders and broken slag, and came to rest against a fir stump with her mouth full of grit and her ears full of the train going on without her. It did not slow. The last car dwindled around the rock cut, its red lamp swinging, and the silence that poured in behind it was the loudest thing she had ever heard. 3 weeks ago, she had been measuring silk against a customer's waist in a shop on Queen Street. Now she was a thing the railway had shaken off its boot somewhere in the Selkirks, and the mountains did not so much as turn to look. For a while she only lay there. The cinders had opened the heel of her hand and torn the good wool of her travelling coat. The coat she had sewn herself and let out twice as the years got harder, and the blood that came up looked very bright against the grey of the cinders and the dirty white of the first snow lying in the shadows. She could taste copper. Her left hip throbbed where the man's boot had caught her on the way out the baggage door, and somewhere under the fear there was a small, stupid voice, still keeping accounts, still saying that coat cost more than you have. You cannot afford to ruin it, as though anything in the world could be afforded now. She got her knees under her. The valley fell away below the grade, in a tumble of black spruce and white water. A river down there going hard over stones, and above the timber the peaks stood up grey and toothed with the snow already on them, and the sky behind the peaks had gone the colour of cold ash. The wind found her at once. It came straight off the snowfields and went through the wool as if the wool were paper, and it smelled of pitch and of rock and of something colder underneath, the smell of winter, standing just off stage, waiting for its cue. Della had not cried when the brakeman found her curled behind the mail sacks. She had not cried when he looked at the empty place where her ticket should have been and said that the Canadian Pacific did not run a charity. Not for shop girls who could not keep a husband or a shop, and that she could walk to wherever it was. She imagined she was going. She had only looked at his bad teeth, and gone where he pushed her. Because the truth was that the cold offered her nothing worse than what was waiting back east, and she was tired enough of being afraid that one more fear hardly registered. But now, standing on the empty grade with the light going, and her breath smoking, and her ruined hand throbbing, she felt something move in her chest that was not despair, and was not pride either. It was a plain animal objection. She did not want to die out here. She found somewhat to her surprise that she very badly did not want to die out here, so she walked. She did not know which way the nearest town lay. Slate Creek the brakeman had sneered 2 days west, as though that settled anything. West was where the train had gone, so she went west along the ties, her thin city boots already coming apart at the seam, every step on the ballast, a small separate punishment travelling up through the bruise in her hip, a mile. Then she stopped counting miles. The sky went from ash to slate to the deep blue-black of an old bruise, and the cold stopped being a coat she wore and became something inside her, in the marrow, a slow heaviness that made the ground look almost soft. The noises started when the dark came down. In the city, the night had been carriages and drunk men singing and the comfortable clatter of 1,000 other lives going on around hers. Here, the dark made its own sounds, and none of them were friendly. A branch cracked somewhere off to her right, and she stood stock-still, her heart going like a sewing machine treadle until whatever it was moved off through the brush. Once something coughed in the timber, low and wet, a sound with a great deal of body behind it, and she gripped the cold rail and did not breathe until it had gone. The moon came up over the peaks and laid down a thin skeleton light along the rails, and by that light she stumbled, caught her toe on a tie, and went down hard, opening her chin on the iron. She did not get up that time. The cold had got past the place where it hurt. It had become a kind of mercy, a great gentle weight settling over her, telling her that she had walked far enough now, that she might rest her cheek against the tie just for a minute, just to gather herself. Her eyes were closing. The river down in the dark sang her something she could almost follow. A twig snapped, close, and a low voice said, "You'll freeze doing that." Her eyes came open. A shape had separated itself from the black wall of the timber, and it was wrong, somehow too tall, too broad, with the flat shine of a gun barrel coming off it where the moonlight caught. It came down the embankment, without hurry, placing each boot with the certainty of a man who had crossed worse ground in worse dark, and it stopped a few paces off, and stood looking down at her, a big man in a coat of patched hides, marten and something heavier, with a beard gone wild over the lower half of his face, and a long rifle held loose across his body, not pointed at her, only ready. He smelled of wood smoke and old grease, and the cold, clean iron of the gun. "Who are you?" Della said, and hated how thin it came out. In the shop her voice had carried across a crowded room. Now it was the sound a rabbit makes. The man did not answer right away. He tilted his head, and the moon caught his eyes, which were a pale, flat grey, the grey of river ice, and gave nothing away. "Off the line, I expect," he said at last. "They put you off." It was not a question. He had only to look at her boots, at the city wool gone to rags, at the blood drying black on her chin. "You're dressed to die out here. You know that. Thank you," she got out through chattering teeth. I had begun to suspect. Something moved in the beard that might have been the start of a smile, and might only have been the wind. He crouched down on his heels in front of her, the rifle laid across his knees, and reached into his coat and brought out something dark and tossed it into her lap, a strip of dried meat, hard as a strop, salt and smoke coming off it. "Chew that," he said. "Put some fat in you. Cold takes the fat first." She picked it up because she had nothing left to lose by it. It tasted of ash and old blood, but the salt hit the back of her tongue, and her whole mouth woke up and ached, and she chewed and made herself swallow. He watched her do it the way a man watches an animal he is deciding whether to keep. "Anybody waiting on you?" he said. "Anywhere?" "No." The truth was easier than a lie just then. "No one. Nothing." He grunted at that, low. He looked off down the line, then up at the timber where the cold was coming from. "Slate Creek's 2 days," he said. "You'd not make 2 hours in those boots before your feet went, and that's if the cats leave you be. There's been a big Tom working this draw." He rubbed a thumb along his jaw, a dry, rasping sound, and seemed to come to the edge of some decision and not want to step over it. "Got a place up the ridge," he said finally. "It's no parlor, but there's a stove in it and a roof that holds." She had lived long enough among men who sold things to know that nothing was given freely, least of all by a stranger in the dark. "And the cost," she said. He told her plainly, which she would learn was the only way he told anything. "Winter's a week out, maybe less. I run a trap line 3 days long, and I've a horse down lame, and a smokehouse full of meat going off because there's only one of me. I need the line walked when I can't walk it. I need the fire kept, and the hide scraped, and the place not burned down while I'm out in the snow." He looked at her straight then, the flat grey eyes holding hers. "I don't need a guest," he said. "I need a wife, not for the look of it, a working one. Somebody to keep the place alive so the cold doesn't take it, while my back's turned." The words hung between them in the freezing air. A wife. She understood at once that he did not mean anything tender by it. He meant a hired hand he need not pay and could not easily lose. A partnership made of labor and 4 walls, the frontier's idea of a contract written with a stranger, because there was no one else within 40 miles to write it with. It ought to have frightened her more than it did. Perhaps she was too cold to be properly frightened. Perhaps, after the creditors and the fiancé, who had thought better of it, and the brakeman's boot, a bargain stated this plainly, was almost a relief. "I don't know how to scrape a hide," she said. Her voice shook, and she could no longer tell whether it was the cold or the rest of it. "You'll learn," he said. "Or you won't, and you'll sit here, and by morning it won't matter either way." He stood, unfolding to his full height, and turned his back on her and faced the timber, leaving her no room to weep at him and no room to argue. "Halt," he said, as if remembering she might want to know. "Up or stay. Make up your mind. I'm cold." Della looked at the black rails, at the cold ground that had so nearly taken her, at the broad hide-covered back already half turned toward the trees. She thought of the shop with the bailiff's notice nailed to the door. She thought of her father's grave and the debts that outlived him. She put her torn hands flat on her own bruised knees and pushed herself up, swaying, her stomach turning over, but she came up and she stayed up. "I'll want a coat," she said. He didn't turn around. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from his pack and threw it over his shoulder without looking, and she caught it. It was greasy, and it smelled of wet dog and wood smoke, and she wrapped it around herself like the finest thing she had ever owned. The climb undid whatever dignity she had left. Holt did not walk so much as flow up through the timber, ducking deadfall, parting the alder with one arm, while she came stumbling and gasping behind him, with the blanket suffocating her and her boots, finally giving up the ghost, the soles flapping loose, so the snow and the sharp duff cut straight through her stockings. He never once put out a hand. When she went down full length in the wet snow with the wind knocked clean out of her, he only stopped a dozen paces on and waited, a dark, patient shape, until she got herself up again. "Keep moving," was all he said. "You stop, you sweat, and the sweat freezes." She came to hate him with a clean, burning hatred that turned out to be very good fuel, and she used it, climbing on his hatred and her own, telling herself over and over that she was Della Marsh, that she had cut a wedding gown for the mayor's daughter, that she would not die in the muck, behind a man who smelled of rancid grease. The hours blurred into black trunks and silver snow. She stopped, feeling her feet hit the ground. She was moving on spite, alone when the trees thinned at last, and the wind hit them broadside off the open ridge. The cabin, when she could make it out, was not a cabin, by any measure she had ever used. It was a low dark hut of unpeeled logs, chinked with moss and clay. The roof a slope of sod and split timber already crusted with snow, smoke leaking thin from a stack of mortared stone. A lean-to off one end with hides stretched on frames. A pen where something large and four-legged shifted and blew in the dark. No porch, no window worth the name. A black dog came stiff-legged out of the lean-to, hackled and silent, and Holt said one low word, and it dropped its hackles and came to press against his leg. Inside it was close and dark and warm, in a way that made her whole body shudder with the change. One room, a dirt floor packed hard as stone, an iron stove ticking, a rope bed, a plank table, tin and bundled herbs on a shelf, a smell of grease and ash, and the animal musk of drying fur. He lit a slush lamp and the light jumped yellow on the soot-black logs. The dog circled twice and lay down by the stove with a sigh and watched her the way its master did. Deciding, he gave her the bed that first night because she could not have made it to the floor. She lay rigid under his pelts, certain he would come for her in the dark, certain that the bargain meant what she had spent her whole life being warned it meant. He did not come. She heard him roll into the blankets on the floor on the far side of the stove, heard his breathing go long and even, and somewhere before morning she understood that whatever he had meant by the word wife, this was not the part of it he had been bargaining for. The understanding did not make her trust him, but it let her sleep. The days that followed were a single grinding labor. She learned the work the way a person learns a foreign country, by getting everything wrong first. She learned to feed the stove without smoking herself out, to render fat without scorching it, to take a bone scraper to a stretched hide and draw it down without tearing the skin, her wrists screaming, her city-soft hands splitting at the knuckles and going stiff with cold and grease. She learned the lame horse was called Bishop and liked his nose rubbed, and that the black dog was Pitch, and could not be bought with anything, only earned. Holt taught by showing once and walking away. He did not praise. He did not scold either, much, only set the next thing in front of her and watched whether she could do it. They moved around each other in the cramped dark, like two strange cats, shut in a crate, careful, watchful, saying nothing that did not have to do with wood or weather or work, but the close quarters made a person notice things. She came to know the difference in his step on the dirt floor, the dragging scuff when he came in, spent from the line, and the quick, even tread when he'd cut fresh sign. She learned that the raw meat smell of him had under it pine pitch from the traps and the cold metal of gun oil, and that he washed more than she'd have credited, scrubbing his hands and forearms over a basin of melted snow he heated on the stove before he'd touch food, so that whatever else he was not the filthy thing she'd taken him for in the dark. The matter of washing was no small one to her. In Toronto, a hot bath had been a thing she took for granted, a comfort so ordinary she had never once thought to be grateful for it, and out here the want of it sat on her worse than the hard food or the labor, a small, constant indignity, she'd asked, the third day, half expecting to be laughed at, whether a body might wash properly out here, and Holt had only looked at her and said that a body had better, in winter, or the skin broke and the brakes went bad, and a man could die of being dirty as easy as of being shot. He showed her the cedar tub behind the curtain in the corner, and the trick of it, snow melted and heated by turns in the big iron pot, a kettle always kept going on the back of the stove, so there was warm water for the asking. It was not a hot bath on Queen Street, but the night she first lowered herself into water, she had heated with her own hands, in the dark behind the curtain, with the wind howling outside. She cried a little, quietly, for no reason she could have named, and felt better for it after. One evening the wind was working a low, mournful note through the chinking, and she sat at the table fighting a torn seam in one of his wool shirts with a dull needle, her own clothes long since past saving, drowning in his cast-off canvas trousers belted with rope. Her fingers were stiff. She drove the needle hard at the heavy wool, and it slipped and went up under her thumbnail to the quick. The word that came out of her was not one she had used aloud in her life, and she clapped her bleeding thumb into her mouth and squeezed her eyes shut. Across the room, he stopped oiling the trap in his hands. She braced for some hard word. In her old life, an outburst like that earned a governess's reprimand or her father's cold silence. Holt only set the trap down and crossed the small room, and took from the shelf a little stoppered horn of something dark and set it on the table in front of her without quite looking at her face. "Balsam and yarrow," he said, low. "Goes on the puncture. It'll burn. But you lose that thumb to rot, and you can't grip a scraper, and then where am I?" He went back to his trap before she could find anything to say. She uncorked the horn. The smell was sharp and clean and medicinal. She dabbed it on, and it burned exactly as promised, a white searing line of it, so that she gasped, and then under the burn the pain went strangely quiet. She looked across at his broad back, hunched over the steel jaws of the trap, the big scarred hands working the spring, with a care that surprised her every time. She saw it. He had not made her thank him. He had named an injury, handed her a cure, and pinned it to a reason of his own, so that she need not feel beholden. It was, she was coming to understand, the only kind of tenderness he knew how to offer, and it was a great deal more honest than most of the tender words that had ever been said to her. "Thank you," she said anyway. The words came stiff, unpracticed. He grunted, pulling a rag through the trap. "Don't bleed on the wool," he said. "Took me a week to full that cloth." But she had seen the corner of his mouth move, and she went back to her sewing, with the anger that usually warmed her gone oddly thin, replaced by something more confusing and harder to hold. The storm came on the morning. The sky did not turn grey, but a swollen yellow-brown, like a bruise 3 days old, and the air went so heavy her ears ached with it. Holt came in from the pen, at a near run which she had never seen him do. "Get the wood in," he said. "All of it now. Then get inside and stay." He went back out into the rising wind to bring Bishop and pitch under the lean-to and tie the door of it, and she hauled wood until her arms shook, and the first real gust of the storm came down off the snowfield like the flat of a hand and nearly took her off her feet. The snow did not fall. It flew sideways, a screaming wall of white grit, and she dropped the last armload inside the door just as Holt fought his way in behind it. The door was the trouble. The wind got into it as he turned to bar it and tore it back against the logs with a crack like a gun, and the cold poured into the little room and put the slush lamp out and dropped the warmth out of the place in a breath. He threw his whole weight against the planks, and they would not close. The mountain was simply stronger than he was. "Get on it!" he shouted over the howl, and she did not stop to think. She put her shoulder to the freezing wood beside his and shoved with everything 2 weeks of labor had built into her, her boots skidding on the dirt, until between them the door came in inch by fighting inch, and the bar dropped home in its brackets, and the screaming dropped at once to a muffled roar against the walls. They both went down against the door, gasping. Snow was crusted in his beard, melting, running off his chin. She had wrenched something in her shoulder, hauling the bar, and it pulsed sickeningly with each beat of her heart. In the red glow from the open stove, they looked at each other across a yard of dirt floor, and for the first time there was nothing of the master in his face. The storm had just shown him how small he was up here, and he knew it, and it had left him only tired and human and rimmed with melting snow. "You held," he said. It was not praise, only a fact set down, but from him it landed like a great weight. "I held," she said. "The storm blew 3 days. They were buried by the second. The drift packed the one window solid, and the door would not open against the weight of it, and there was nothing to do but feed the stove and melt snow and live very close to one another in the dark." She had wondered, in the city, how people managed the plain animal facts of being shut up so, the washing and the rest of it, with no privacy at all. And she learned that you managed by 100 small courtesies, neither of you named: a turned back, a hung blanket, a kettle kept warm, a chamber bucket, set behind the curtain and emptied without comment into the storm porch, where the cold kept it from going foul. It was not delicate. It was a long way from delicate. But there was a kind of dignity in it she had not expected, the dignity of 2 people deciding, without ever saying so, to spare each other shame. It was on the second night that the thing she had been refusing to feel finally arrived, and it arrived because Holt got hurt. He had gone out at the height of it, roped to the corner post, to chip the buried lean-to clear so Bishop and Pitch would not smother, and a slab of frozen sod came off the roof of the lean-to and took him down across the leg. He got back in white to the lips, dragging the leg, and when she cut the canvas away, the shin was wrong, swollen tight and dark, and though it was not broken through the skin, it would not bear him, and just like that, the shape of everything turned over. The strong, silent man who kept them alive was down on the bed, unable to stand, and the city girl who could not scrape a hide 3 weeks past was the only thing standing between the 2 of them and the cold. She found she knew what to do, or near enough, having watched him do it for everything else. She splinted the leg with 2 staves of kindling and strips of the ruined wool. She kept the fire fed all that endless night and the next. Melt snow, packing the swollen leg in cloths wrung from snow-cold water and then warm, turn and turn about the way he had shown her for her own torn shoulder. She brought the warm kettle to his cracked lips, when the fever came up in him, supported the back of his neck, the way he had no doubt meant to do for her if she had been the one to fall. He was a terrible patient. He kept trying to rise. "There's the line," he said, raving low. "The martins spoil. There's no one to walk the line." And she pressed him back with the flat, firm pressure of a hand she had learned from watching him gentle the horse, and said there was someone to walk the line, that she would walk it, that he had not got himself a useless wife after all. Now would he kindly lie down before he split his fool head on the stove and gave her a grave to dig in frozen ground. He went quiet at that. In the red dark she thought he had gone under again, but his eyes were open, the flat grey of them gone soft at the edges, watching her. "Why?" he said, hoarse. He did not say why what. She knew what. She thought about it honestly, kneeling there with her ruined hands. "Because you didn't leave me on the rails," she said at last. "When it would have been easier, and because—" She stopped. The wind filled the silence. "Because I've spent my whole life being shut out into the cold by men who could just as well have opened the door. And you opened the door." He looked at her a long time. Then he closed his eyes. "The only thing worse than the cold," he said, so low she nearly lost it under the wind, "is being the only one in it." And he slept, and she sat by him and fed the fire until the grey light came. The screaming stopped on the third morning. She woke to a silence, so deep it felt like a sound, the stove cold, the cabin freezing, and Holt's fever broken and his breathing easy. The drift had buried the door to the height of a man, so she did as she'd watched him do. Opened the shutter onto the solid wall of snow packed in the window frame, and dug through it with the flat iron spade, hacking and tossing the snow inside onto the floor, until at last the spade went through into open air, and a shaft of light came in so white and violent it hurt. She widened the hole and squeezed herself out through the window into a world. Wiped clean, the whole valley smoothed under a flawless, blinding ocean of snow, the sky an aggressive, bottomless blue, and she dug down to free the door from the outside. And then she walked the trapline alone, with Pitch at her heel, 3 days of it, resetting what the storm had sprung, and bringing back 2 marten and a lynx. Because the meat and the fur were the only money they had, and there was no one else to go. When she came back on the second evening, half dead and proud of it, Holt was up on a crutch he'd whittled, hobbling, and he looked at the lynx she dropped on the table, and then at her face, hollowed and chapped and burned by the snow glare, and the hard lines of him broke into a real smile, the first she'd been given, and it was not soft. It was sharp and a little cruel, and entirely the shape of the country. "You set the trap by the deadfall yourself," he said. Not a question. "I did." "Most don't their first winter," he said. "Most don't come back." By the time the eaves began to drip, and the snow went grey and rotten, and the river found its voice again. Under the ice, Della's hands were ruined past mending, and she would not have traded them. The calluses were her own. The lean muscle of her arms was her own. She had butchered and salted and sewn, and walked the line, and she had stitched the long, pale scar a grizzly had left on Holt's ribs 3 winters back, learning it not from any fireside story, but because she had to close a torn seam while he wore the shirt, and her knuckles brushed the raised flesh, and he held his breath and did not pull away. They had a silent choreography between them now. She knew when to step clear of the axe. He left the salt out without being asked. Neither of them had said one word that a person back east would have recognized as love, and yet the cabin had stopped feeling like a cage, and started feeling, against all her expectation, like the one place in the world that was hers. She was at the table behind the cabin, scraping the last of the winter fat off a beaver pelt. The afternoon, a man on horseback came up the half-melted trail leading a pack mule. She had not heard the voice of another human being in 5 months. She came out from under the lean-to with the bone scraper still in her fist, and the long skinning knife strapped to her thigh, and the man drew rein and stared at her, at the canvas trousers and the knife and the dirt across her brow, and grinned around a plug of tobacco. He was clean and round-faced, and altogether too pleased with himself, a trader they called Cleet, who ran goods up to the high cabins twice a year. "Well now," he said, the flat East Coast tin of his voice jarring after so long. "Old Holt found himself a woman, or did he find you on the line and forget to let you go, missus? You blink twice if he's got you chained to that stove." She felt the old fury come up cold and clean, and it surprised her that it was not aimed at Holt at all, but at this soft stranger in his clean hat, who looked at her and saw a victim. She had survived a whiteout. She had walked the line alone. She had earned every speck of the dirt under her nails. "I assure you, Mr. Cleet," she said, and heard her own voice drop into the cool, finished register she had not used since Toronto, the register that had once moved across a crowded shop. That I am quite capable of leaving whenever I please. It cut through the spring air like a blade, and Cleet blinked, thrown by so fine an accent coming out of so feral a woman. The cabin door opened and Holt came out, the rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm, not raised, only there. "Cleet," he said. "Holt," the trader spat into the melting snow. "Brought your flour and your powder and your coffee from the fall order, and some letters come up to Slate Creek." His eyes went back to Della, sly. "Didn't reckon on you having company, though." He swung down off the horse. "You look like you been through a thresher, honey. Tell you what, I'm headed back down to Slate Creek come morning, and from there you can catch the stage to Revelstoke, and the line east, all the way home, if you've a home. Room on the mule and no charge. Say the word." The clearing went quiet. There was only the steady drip of melt off the spruce. She looked at the trader, and for one whole breath, she let herself feel the size of what he was holding out. Hot baths, clean sheets, a town with a church bell, and a dressmaker's window she might stand at again. The chance to be the woman she had been before the rails, before the debts, before the boot in her back. The chance to be Della Marsh of Queen Street once more. But Della Marsh of Queen Street had wept in front of bailiffs, and let a man unsay his promise to her, and gone east to west, the wrong way in a baggage car, and the woman standing in the melting snow with a knife on her hip had not wept in front of anyone in a long time. She turned her head and looked at Holt. He was standing very still, the rifle loose, his eyes down on the muddy ground between them, his face gone carefully blank. He was not going to ask her to stay. She understood that as plainly as she understood anything. He had made a bargain, and the bargain had been kept. She had worked, and he had kept her alive, and the winter was over now, and by the terms of it, she was free to go. He shifted his weight and began, very slightly, to turn back toward the door of the empty cabin. "Leave the flour by the smokehouse," Della said. Holt went still. Cleet stopped chewing. "Beg pardon?" the trader said. "The flour and the coffee," she said, wiping the beaver fat off her hands on a scrap of burlap, and her eyes went up and found Holt's, and his came up fast to hers, a sudden fierce light in the grey of them, burning the blankness clean away. "Set them by the smokehouse, please, not the cabin. I've a pelt to finish before the light goes, and I'll not have a mule tracking mud past my salting table." Cleet looked from one of them to the other for a long, baffled moment, then shook his head and muttered something about high country folk having gone soft in the skull, and started untying the sacks from his mule. Della did not wait to watch him do it. She turned her back on the road east and the stage and the line and the home that was not a home. She walked across the wet ground to where Holt stood, and stopped close enough to smell the wood smoke and the pine pitch on him, which did not smell like a cage anymore. It smelled like the place she lived. "You didn't bring back any rabbits," she said, pragmatic as anything, to cover the way her heart was going. He looked down at her, his jaw working as he took in the size of what she had just done. The hard lines around his eyes eased, just a little. He lifted one big scarred hand and let the backs of his fingers graze the side of her arm, brief, careful, the most he had ever asked of her, without a reason pinned to it. "No," he said, the grey voice gone low. "Reckon I'll have to walk the line again." "I'll come," she said, and they stood there together in the cold spring mud, with the last of the winter going to water around their boots, the trader cursing softly behind them. The high blue country, dripping and shining and indifferent, and theirs. Two hard pieces of the wilderness that had finally, against every odds, found the shape that let them lock together and hold.